So we usually strive to offer a service in roughly an hour time. Today, because the nature of what we're all carrying and the nature of the topic of the service, it's going to go a little longer. If you feel the need that you have to leave at some point, absolutely feel free to go. But reproductive justice, that's what we're talking about today. You know, this is something that's been a topic of controversy and concern for quite some time. And it's a topic that has been heightened by our society's culture wars and the recent rescinding of Roe v. Wade. But what exactly is meant by reproductive justice, and what is at stake in this current time and place? So let's begin with some kind of a definition. Reproductive justice seeks an essential transformation of the systems and institutions that perpetrate oppression into structures that realize justice, and a future when all people can self-determine their own reproductive lives free from discrimination, coercion, or violence. Reproductive justice is about the choice to have children and the choice to not have children. It's about the right to parent the children you do have in a safe and healthy environment. It's about the right to bodily autonomy. It's about education and access to things like contraception, sterilization, prenatal care, supportive labor and delivery, postpartum care, STD prevention, testing and treatment, comprehensive sex education, and abortion. Too often, abortion is the only topic that comes to mind when considering what reproductive justice means. As noted, reproductive justice encompasses so much more, but the right to choose to terminate a pregnancy is at the heart of what makes this conversation such a tender one to have. You know, talking about abortion is the first step to confronting stigma, stopping harmful restrictions, and expanding access. If you follow the news in any way at all, I'm certain that you are aware that this is a significant issue that will be on the ballot in many states in the upcoming election. It's not up on Pennsylvania, but in many states, this is something that's coming up. I think that you're also aware that the restrictive measures that have been put in place by many states since Roe v. Wade, and even before Roe v. Wade was ended, has put many people in very harmful circumstances. A study was published in June by the Pediatrics Journal of the American Medical Association, and that showed that the idea of returning women to roles as wives, or anyone, not just women, but anyone who can bear a child, to roles as wives and mothers by banning abortion has in Texas, which was one of the first states to enact really restrictive legislation. In Texas, this has driven infant death rates 12.9% higher. The rest of the country saw an increase of about 1.8%. Infant deaths from congenital abnormalities increased almost 23% in Texas, while they decreased in the rest of the nation, showing that the abortion ban is forcing women to carry to term fetuses that are not equipped to survive. Talking about our own experiences about abortion to one another helps us to humanize the complexity of what it means, what is involved in making such a choice. Each and every story is unique and worthy of being heard if one feels safe enough to do so. And to that end, I now share mine. Our lives are shaped by our choices and the choices made by so many others in our lives, many of whom we never really get to know. My choice to have an abortion when I was 15 was a surreal experience. I had very little good sex education and no support at home. My mother became pregnant at the age of 17. She and my 16-year-old father married, as this was considered the right thing to do. That child died at the age of 6 weeks due to health complications. I was born about a year and a half later. My mother's experience shaped the way she responded to my own budding sexuality. She understood the difficulties that came from unplanned pregnancies, and she wanted more for me. But her method of conveying her concern was harsh. Rather than talking to me about her challenges, her admonishment to me was to not come to her if I ever got pregnant, and so I didn't. And I'm going to skip the dramatic details, but suffice it to say that the decision to seek an abortion was an emotional one. In the end, the fact that I was able to be cared for in a legal and safe fashion was made possible due to countless others who came before me and told their stories and fought for the legal option to choice rather than having to find some back alley option or proceed with having a child while I was still very much a child myself. Because unlike my mother, Planned Parenthood gave me compassionate, non-judgmental guidance. And just a few years prior to my choice, Roe v. Wade had been made the law of the land. As is always the case, my story is not mine alone. All those who fought for the legalization of abortion are a part of my story. My mother's story was a part of mine, and my daughter's story is a part of mine as mine is of hers. When my daughter and son were teenagers, I felt it was my responsibility to share my story with them, as I firmly believed that talking about reproductive health in all of its complexity was important. Years later, when Texas began enacting its restrictive laws regarding abortion, my daughter publicly shared her own story that I will share with you now. She says, "I've been thinking for the last few years about how important it is for people who have had abortions to share their stories. 1 in 3 people of reproductive age who could bear a child in the US will have an abortion by the age of 45. But given the immense stigma attached, most of us probably don't know who in our lives has been through that experience. And as long as we don't know, it's easier to think that abortion happens rarely and that it only happens to irresponsible, morally questionable people. And that in turn makes it easy to be opposed to abortion access or to feel indifferent about it. As I've been thinking about this for the last few years, I've been thinking that because I have never had an abortion, this is my daughter speaking, because she never had an abortion, I didn't have a role to play in that. But I realized this morning that that is wrong. I haven't had an abortion, but I do have an abortion story. And telling that is important too. So here's my story. The first part of my abortion story is my mother's story. A few months ago, my incredibly courageous mother shared her abortion story publicly and gave me permission to do the same. When my mother was 15, she didn't live in a home where sex ed, let alone sex education, where sex, let alone sex education, was talked about, and she didn't have access to contraception. When she got pregnant, her stepmother supported her and took her to a clinic for an abortion. This is mostly my mother's story, but it is my story too. I don't have any way of knowing what my mother's life would look like if she hadn't had that abortion, but she almost certainly wouldn't have ended up with my father, and while she might have had other children, she would not have had me. So, the story of my mom's abortion is also the story of why I exist. But there is more to my story too. When I was 16, I was lucky to have parents who were willing to talk to me about sex. But like many people at the age of 16, talking to my parents about sex was the last thing I wanted to do. At 16, I couldn't afford reliable birth control, but at 16, I was also aware of Planned Parenthood. As I made a decision for myself to become sexually active, I went to them and they treated me professionally, courteously, and warmly. They helped me to understand the benefits and drawbacks of different forms of contraception and to make an informed decision about which one would work best for me. They gave me my first pap smear and they talked to me about STIs and told me that I could come back for screening to make sure that I could keep myself and my partner healthy. Then they gave me 3 months' supply of birth control pills and kept giving them to me every 3 months for the next several years. And crucially, they did it all for free. The consequence of all of that is the next part of my abortion story. Because I had access to Planned Parenthood, I was in a position to make educated, responsible choices about my reproductive health and reproductive life. And because I had access to Planned Parenthood, I never had an unplanned pregnancy, and I never had to decide whether or not to have an abortion. In a very real sense, I owe the fact that I exist to my mother's abortion, and in an equally real sense, I owe the contours of my life to Planned Parenthood and other organizations like it that allowed me to make my own reproductive decisions. And that allowed me to keep the necessity of abortion off the table. If I had had an unplanned pregnancy and a child at 16 or 18 or even beyond, I very likely wouldn't have finished college or maybe even gone in the first place. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and doing it was anything but a foregone conclusion. I wouldn't now have a doctorate. I wouldn't have gotten to travel the world to learn an immense amount about myself in the process. I wouldn't be spending my life trying to make room for women in a profession where only about 20% of tenured and tenure-track professors are women. I wouldn't be waking up every day, every day of my life and going to work to do literally the only thing I've wanted to do since I was 19. I owe the life that I love to the fact that I have the tools to decide responsibly what happens to my body. 1 in 3 people capable of giving birth in the United States will have an abortion before the age of 45. They all have stories. Some of them will share them publicly, and they are courageous. Others won't, and I completely understand that, given the stigma that comes with abortion in our society as it stands. But I bet that the vast majority, the other 2/3, have abortion stories too. They have abortion stories like mine about the fact that they never had to consider abortion for themselves because Planned Parenthood and other organizations gave them the tools that they needed. So please, when you think about whether and to what extent to support abortion, think about all of the people in your life with abortion stories, whether or not they are stories that they have shared with you. Now, returning to my own story, had I given birth to a child at the age of 15, my life would have been much different. Better or worse is impossible for me to know. But it would not have contained my daughter Rosa or my son Paolo, and that is difficult for me to imagine. Having had the experience of making that difficult choice to abort, and then later in my life having the absolute gift of giving birth to 2 wonderful humans, I don't know that I would have chosen to have an abortion again. I understand deeply how precious life is and why people feel so strongly about this topic. But raising a child is hard work. There's no getting around that. And I could never assume to know what is right for another person. One could argue that the child that never was in my life would have grown up to be someone that I now could not imagine not having in my life. Knowing what I know at this point in my life, that is something that I will and will continue to hold tenderly in my heart. It's my sincere hope that as a society, as a world, we come to hold all life as precious, which certainly includes all people who, for whatever reason, feel that abortion is the only choice they can make. This is such a personal issue that lawmakers have no business legislating a person's right to choose. Rather than law, compassion and education, and yes, love, not legislation and judgment, are what is needed at the center of this debate. Keeping love at the center of all that we do truly is what we are called upon. As you go forth to vote this year, vote with your values, vote towards the world that you want. Know that this is one issue that's out there. There are many, many others, but go forth holding the values of the world that you wish to see created. Let's just, again, take a collective breath. And I'm going to offer a ritual for reproductive choice that was created by Julia Hamilton. In this sanctuary, we create together a place for all of our stories, the ones we share and the ones that we hold close and quiet in our hearts, the stories that bring us joy and fulfillment, and the stories that break us open, the stories that change and grow with us, and the stories that we outgrow and leave behind. Each and every one of you carries a lifetime of stories every time you walk into this space or you just walk into your life. This morning, there may be stories from your life that surface in unexpected ways, and I would like to invite you into a ritual to hold space for your story, whatever it may be. And if you need support after the service, please do not hesitate to reach out. As I enter into each of these different areas for the different paths that have been chosen, if you recognize yourself in one of these prayers, I invite you to put your hand over your heart, wherever you are, and know that you are not alone. There is someone else in this gathered community holding their hand over their heart too. After each prayer, I invite the congregation to respond with these words. So I'll say them now and then I'll repeat them again. May the beginnings and the endings in our stories be held in unconditional love and acceptance. I'll begin with those whose story includes the choice to end a pregnancy. The circumstances vary, the timelines of our lives are diverse, but each and every end is also a beginning. And so I hold this space for all who have aborted a pregnancy or partnered with someone in an abortion for whatever reason, under whatever circumstance. May we say together, may the beginnings and endings in our stories be held in unconditional love and acceptance. I now hold space for those whose story includes the unwanted loss of a pregnancy or a struggle with fertility. The circumstances vary, the timelines of our lives are diverse, but the pain of infertility, miscarriage, and stillbirth are too often held in silence. And so this space is held for all who have traveled this path of loss for whatever reason, under whatever circumstance. And again, may the beginnings and endings in our stories be held in unconditional love and acceptance. I now hold space for those whose story includes the choice to give birth. The circumstances vary, the timelines of our lives are diverse, but the choice to bring a new life into the world is a powerful one. And so this space is held for all who have given birth or partnered with the birth of a child, or those who have adopted a child by birth by someone else, for whatever reason, under whatever circumstance. And again, may the beginnings and endings in our stories be held in unconditional love and acceptance. Let us now hold space for those whose story includes the choice to not conceive or have children. The circumstances vary, the timelines of our lives are diverse, but the freedom to chart the course of our own reproductive life is sacred. I light this candle for all who have made the decision to not conceive or bear children, for whatever reason, under whatever circumstance. May the beginnings and the endings of our stories be held in unconditional love and acceptance. Let us hold space now for those whose story includes a forced choice, or no choice at all, or who have encountered violence where there should have been tenderness and care. The circumstances vary, the timelines of our lives are diverse, but not everyone has been in the position to control their own reproductive choices. Let us hold this space for all who have found themselves unable to exercise their own sacred reproductive freedom for whatever reason, under whatever circumstance. May the beginnings and endings in our stories be held in unconditional love and acceptance. Lastly, I hold space for those whose reproductive story is still being written. The circumstances vary, the timelines of our lives are diverse, but the future unfolds in surprising and unexpected ways that can be both beautiful and heartbreaking. And so this space is held for all who are at the threshold, who have agency and choices still to make about their reproductive lives, for whatever reason, under whatever circumstances. May the beginnings and endings in our stories be held in unconditional love and acceptance. May the space that we have created here and the many stories they represent remind us of the fire of commitment we carry inside to ensure that all people have freedom and agency over their reproductive choices and that their reproductive justice is upheld as a fundamental right for this and future generations. Again, let's just breathe collectively. We're holding a lot. If you need to speak to someone who you're close with, do so. You can speak to me. These are big, big, brave, hard choices that we are faced with.